Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in U.S. history. Today, we'll look into a mystery that has been going on for hundreds of years and has been kept secret by the Catholic Church in the woods of North Carolina. These secrets should never have been forgotten. Leave a comment about where you are watching from as we try to figure out this scary story. It was 1849. In the slopes of the Appalachians, far away from everything else, the city of Asheville was just starting to take shape. Mountains naturally blocked the way, and winter could keep people stuck for weeks. North Carolina still had the marks of the westward advance, and law was not very present in that rough land. People from religious groups were starting to move into the area, bringing faith and order to places that many people thought were wild. Sister Catherine Marlowe, a nun from the Order of the Sisters of Mercy, showed up at this time. She had been sent from Baltimore to start a small mission near Asheville. Records from Buncombe County show. She got there with 2 other nuns in March of that year. They came with the goal of giving the settlers spread out across the mountainous area access to schooling and medical care. Kate was 28 years old when she first set foot in those cold places. Letters kept in the Baltimore Diocese and archives describe her as a woman with strong faith who was driven and not afraid of anything. She left a wealthy home in Massachusetts to serve God with her whole life. The first few weeks she spent in Asheville. People wrote about them in a personal notebook that was kept in a wooden chest and wasn't found until many years later. In that notebook, Catherine wrote about how beautiful the scenery was. Mountain ranges that were blue at dawn, streams that cut through deep valleys and thick fog that covered everything before dawn. But she also caught something scary on tape. She said that when she walked through the woods near the mission, she always felt like someone was watching her. She talked about seeing strange lights far away at night, of the words people in the area said when she walked by. The colonists quickly built a simple wooden building for the mission because they saw the nuns as a sign of hope for society. The church was small and had rough benches and an altar that was made from scratch. Catherine led weekly masses, took care of the sick, and taught people who wanted to learn how to read. Before autumn came along and changed everything, the first month seemed to go as planned. In October 1849, Catherine started getting visits at night from people from the area who didn't want to be seen during the day. These confessions were scary because they were about things that the church said were wrong and about meetings that were held in secret in the woods. She wrote it all down and kept the confessions secret, but her words showed that she was becoming more worried. There was something going on in those mountains that the official Catholic Society either didn't know about or chose to ignore. Catherine's behavior began to change in front of the 2 nuns who were with her. She prayed quietly for hours by herself in the church, and when asked about it, she would only say that she was carrying secrets with her that she couldn't share. It was getting close to winter, and the feeling of being alone got worse. The roads were blocked, and the mission turned into an island in the middle of snowy mountains. That December, Catherine made a choice that would set her fate in stone. It's possible that the long letter she wrote to the Bishop of Baltimore will never get to its target. In that letter, she told of troubling things she had learned about things that were done in that area under the guise of religion. She named well-known people and talked about practices that mixed Catholicism with much older traditions. She then asked for help right away on how to move forward. A message that had never been sent was later found hidden among the mission's floorboards. Catherine went missing on the night of December 23, 1849, Christmas Eve, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a trail that the Catholic Church would follow. Make sure to get rid of from government records. What really took place that cold night in the Appalachians? What was the reason her name was taken off of all church records? What did she find that was so dangerous that it had to be kept secret forever? The mission was very quiet in the early hours of December 24, 1849. When the 2 nuns who shared a room with Catherine woke up, They couldn't find her. There was nothing on her bed, like it had never been used that night. The rosary she always kept next to her bed had, the same way she did. The sisters were most interested when they saw that the main door was locked from the inside. All the windows were shut, and there were no signs of a fight or other commotion. After 3 days, it became clear that Catherine would not come back on her own, so Buncombe County Sheriff Thomas Hicks was called in. People in that area often got lost on mountain trails, so Hicks was known for how well he solved cases involving missing people. He carefully looked into the case, talked to the nuns, and talked to people in the area. The answer was the same for everyone. That night, no one had seen or heard anything strange. The sheriff's records kept in the county files have a lot of interesting information. Hicks said that he found marks in the church from candles that had just been put out, which showed that someone had been there early in the morning. He also saw that Catherine's personal diary was open and on the table. The most recent writing was from December 22nd. In the last post, she wrote about a realization she had. Received during her prayers, something that scared her and made her resolved to do something. The investigation went on for a few more weeks, but it was hard to look in the mountains because of the harsh winter. The snow covered the paths, erased the tracks, and turned the land into a white maze that could not be found. Hicks put together search groups that looked all around the mission and for several kilometers around, but they couldn't find Catherine. It looked like she had just disappeared into that cold winter night. What made the sheriff angry were the strange responses of some people in the town when he brought up the nun's name. Some people looked away, others quickly changed the subject, and some seemed afraid, as if talking about Catherine could lead to something bad. Hicks knew he was dealing with more than just someone going missing. In that neighborhood there were secrets. Slowly, layers of silence built up over time. In February 1850, a senior citizen went to see Hicks alone. The man, who did not want his name to be used, said that on the night of the disappearance, he had seen lights moving toward the ruins of an old church that had been abandoned about 5 kilometers north of the mission. This chapel was built by French colonists many years ago, but it was left empty when the town split up. People in the area didn't like the place, so they avoided going by it even during the day. Hicks chose to check out the ruins. When he got to the spot, with the help of 2 others, he found a partly collapsed stone structure that was covered in moss and plants. Recently, marks in the snow around the area showed that several people had been walking on it. Inside the empty church, the sheriff found something very scary. Candles set in a circle, still fresh ashes from a campfire, and strange carvings on the stone walls that didn't look like they were part of the original Catholic decor. It was even scarier to find a piece of black fabric, the kind worn by nuns, got stuck in a crack in the rocks. The cloth looked like it had been ripped off with a lot of force. Hicks kept the proof and kept looking into it, but after that his research started to run into problems he didn't expect. Raleigh, the city of North Carolina, sent orders to close the case, saying that there weren't enough resources and that searches could not go on during the winter. At first, the sheriff refused, but greater and greater pressure from higher officials made him give in. The study has been officially ended. He wrote down an enigmatic phrase in his personal records. There are powers in this land that do not answer to the law of men, and secrets that wish to remain buried. A few months later, Hicks moved to a different county, taking with him papers that he never gave to his successors. At the same time, the Catholic Church was taking its own steps. The 2 nuns who had been with Catherine were quietly sent to different convents, one in Pennsylvania and the other in Louisiana. The Asheville mission was officially closed in March 1850 because it didn't have enough money to keep running. The building was sold to a local merchant, who turned it into a warehouse. All records about Sister Catherine Marlowe started to disappear from the diocesan archives. For the next few years, nothing was said about the case. In 1856, the mission that had housed Catherine was torn down, and a grain warehouse was built in its place. People who had known the nun. People in Asheville and the surrounding mountains slowly moved away or stopped talking about what happened. It was like they had made a deal to forget. But mysteries don't stay hidden forever. In 1873, a historian named Edmund Whitmore came to Asheville to study the spread of Catholic religious orders across the southern Appalachians. Whitmore was a meticulous person who had spent years gathering information on missions that had been set up in North Carolina. When Whitmore was looking through records in the Buncombe County archives, he came across a strange discrepancy. There were scattered references to a mission run by nuns between 1849 and 1850, but no name or religious order was given. This made him curious, so he started to look into it further. He found purchase receipts for supplies signed by someone named Sister M, pieces of correspondence that mentioned the nuns of the mountain mission, and a report by. The historian heard from Sheriff Thomas Hicks about a missing person case and realized that something had been purposely left out of the records. His academic interest turned into a determination to find out what had been hidden. Whitmore went to Baltimore and asked to see the archives of the Sisters of Mercy. At first, he was greeted warmly, but when he mentioned Asheville in the year 1849, doors started to close. The people in charge of the archives said that many documents had been lost in a fire that. The historian was told that any information about the nuns who worked in North Carolina during that time was religiously secret and could not be shared. This made him angry, but not defeated. He then spent months talking to older people who had lived in Asheville during that time. Most of them didn't want to talk, but an 80-year-old woman who had been a girl when the mission was active agreed to share her memories. She talked about a dark-haired nun who... This nun went to isolated families in the mountains to bring them medicine and spiritual comfort. She had soft eyes that showed a deep sadness, as if she knew something bad she couldn't say. The old woman also said something that made Whitmore stop writing and just listen. The night the nun disappeared, her family had heard strange sounds coming from the direction of the old empty chapel. They were chants, which were male voices singing together in a language she didn't understand. Her father had locked all the doors and windows and told no one to leave the house until dawn. When word of the disappearance spread the next day, her father said that she was the only one who saw what she shouldn't have. With this information, Whitmore decided to go see the ruins of the old chapel. By 1873, the site was even worse, and the forest was almost covering it up. But the historian was determined, and he spent days exploring the area and taking pictures of the carvings on the stones. He carefully copied symbols on the stone walls that mixed Catholic symbols with other things he couldn't identify. He also found a small silver relic with human hair on it and a piece of paper with names written in faded ink. The names on the paper were of important people in Asheville society at the time, like respected merchants, a retired judge, and landowners. Whitmore carefully copied the names without fully understanding what his discovery meant. When he got back to the city and started looking into these men, he found that they had all done very well after 1850, getting rich and powerful in ways that didn't seem to fit with the opportunities in the area at the time. The historian put together a manuscript of his findings that he planned to publish as part of a larger study on Catholic missions in the South. The chapter on Asheville was called The Forgotten Nun of the Appalachians, and it raised some disturbing questions. Why had a nun been? Systematic deletion from the records. What kind of knowledge did she have that made it okay for them to keep this information secret? What was the link between her disappearance and the men whose names were hidden in that inquiry? Before Whitmore could publish his work, he got threatening calls from well-dressed men who said they were from North Carolina and offered him a lot of money in exchange for all the documents and notes related to the Asheville case. The next week, someone broke into his office and stole all of his research materials, including the original manuscript, photos of the chapel ruins, and copies of the names found on the reirie. Edmund Whitmore gave up on the case because he was afraid for his own safety and never talked about the missing nun again in public. In his personal notes, which were found decades after his death, he wrote, "There are truths that society is not ready to face, and powers that extend beyond common sense." I understand. Catherine Marlowe found something in the woods of Appalachia that made it impossible for her to tell her story. The 1900s brought Asheville more modern things, but they also brought no answers. As the city grew and the roads were cleared, more and more tourists came to the mountains, which used to be very remote. In 1901, the old, broken-down chapel was totally destroyed to make room for a road that connected rural areas. Any physical proof that might have been left at that spot was broken up and forgotten. But stories have a funny way of living on, even when everyone tries to bury them. In 1924, workers were fixing up the old Asheville Town Hall when they found a secret room hidden behind a brick wall. There were papers from the last 100 years in an old metal box inside. There was a set of letters that had never been sent before. They were written by Thomas Herricks, the sheriff who had looked into Catherine's abduction. These letters were sent to a Raleigh district attorney, and Hendricks had never put these kinds of in-depth results in his official reports. In the letters, the sheriff talked about how he kept looking into things in secret, even after being told to end the case. He had quietly asked members of the local elite about their groups, and found that many of them were part of a closed society that met in the mountains. Even though these talks weren't illegal in and of themselves, the fact that they were kept so secret was scary. Hendrick thought Catherine might have learned about the presence of these talks, and something about them scared her very much. The story of a talk the sheriff had with a person who did not want to be named was even more telling. This witness, who only gave his name as Jay, said he had been to a meeting in the empty church on the night of December 23, 1849. According to his statement, the nun had shown up out of the blue and cut off the meeting. She reportedly confronted the people there and said they were disrespecting sacred teachings and doing practices not in line with the Catholic faith. The source said Catherine was brave even when she was by herself in a room full of strong guys. From what the source said, what happened next was very unclear. A lot of anger and threats were exchanged, and Catherine was then reportedly taken out of the church. The source said they left before seeing the result. Too scared to stay. He told Hicks that he had been feeling guilty ever since that night, but he was afraid to go to court and speak. In the letters, the sheriff said that the informant left the area soon after the talk and was never seen again. In Hendrick's letters, there was also a disturbing idea. He thought Catherine hadn't just vanished, but that her disappearance had something to do with the group's secret activities. The sheriff said it sounded like the nun had been silenced to protect families with powerful names and secrets that could bring them down. Even more interesting, Hicks said he wrote a private letter to the Archbishop of Baltimore telling him what he had found and asking the church to help. No one ever replied to this letter. The records found in 1924 made a short stir in the community, but they were quickly put back where they belonged. The Asheville Press wrote a few stories about the discovery, but they didn't think it was very important because they saw it as just an interesting piece of history. But a reporter named Robert Clayton became interested in the story and chose to look into it himself. He was known for his investigation work and wasn't easily scared off. First, he looked for the children and grandchildren of the people who were listed in Hendrick's papers. Many of these families were still well known in Asheville and had high roles in business and government. Clayton started to ask about things that happened in 1849, but he was met with closed doors and vague replies. Some descendants said they had no idea that their ancestors were involved with secret groups. Others just wouldn't talk to him. Clausen. He added Catholic Church archives to his study. He went to Baltimore and was able to talk to some old Dassis contacts. That is where he found something very interesting, a brief mention of the North Carolina incident in a record from 1850, along with a note saying that the right steps were taken to protect the order's image. Even though there were no more details, the tone of the message made it sound like the church knew something important was going on and chose to keep quiet about it. What the reporter also found that there was not a single official record of Catherine Marlowe's presence in the Sisters of Mercy's archives. It was like she had never died, never joined the order, or taken her vows. The fact that there was no paperwork at all was itself proof. Someone had worked very hard to get rid of all signs of her presence. Clayton wrote in his personal notes, "I am sure that Catherine Marlowe found something that scared powerful people, both religious and secular. Her disappearance wasn't an accident, and the person who erased her existence did so on purpose and with planning. But what did she find? And why does this secret still need to be kept secret after all these years?" The journalist promised himself that he would keep looking into it until he found answers. But Robert Clayton never published his research. He died in 1926 in what was officially reported as a car accident on winding mountain roads. His car went off the road during a storm and crashed into a tree. All of his notes on the Catherine Marlowe case were in the car and were destroyed in the accident. The journalist's friends had doubts about the official story, but no further investigation was done. The case was almost completely forgotten over the next few decades, as the Great Depression, World War II, and the social changes that happened across the United States pushed the mysteries of the 19th century to the background. Asheville continued to do well as a tourist destination. It was famous for its beautiful scenery and clean mountain air. Few people remembered the nun who went missing almost 100 years before, and those who didn't want to talk about it. The case didn't come up again until 1967, when a retired teacher named Margaret Sinclair was cataloging old papers donated to the Asheville Public Library and found a partially burned diary. The pages were fragile, and the ink was faded but still readable. To her surprise, it belonged to one of the nuns who had gone missing. Catherine Marlowe had gone on the mission with Catherine in 1849. Sister Elizabeth, one of the two nuns who saw the disappearance, kept the diary. The entries were made from March to December 1849, with the last one being made on December 25th, the day after Catherine went missing. The pages gave a personal look at the events leading up to that fateful night, and what was written there was very upsetting. Sister Elizabeth said that Catherine was a woman with strong beliefs who... Catherine was getting more and more upset by what she saw in the local community. She noticed that some families' religious practices weren't quite right. Rituals were being done in secret that mixed Catholic elements with traditions that seemed to come from other places. When she asked about these actions, she got vague answers or veiled hostility. In a November entry, Elizabeth wrote about an evening when Catherine came back to the mission clearly upset. She had been invited to stay the night. She went to dinner at the home of a famous merchant and noticed strange symbols subtly carved into the wooden beams of the house. When she asked about them, the host quickly changed the subject, and things got tense. Catherine told Elizabeth that those symbols had nothing to do with traditional Catholicism. The diary also showed that Catherine had started writing down everything she found. She kept a second notebook separate from her personal diary where she wrote down her findings. This notebook had names, dates, and descriptions of strange activities. Elizabeth talked about it several times, calling it the Record of Shadows. Catherine kept this document secret, and only Elizabeth knew it existed. The nun was afraid that if the wrong people found out what was in that notebook, bad things would happen. In the entry for December 22nd, the day before Catherine disappeared, Elizabeth wrote that Catherine had made up her mind. She would face those responsible. Catherine was determined to find out what was going on and take evidence with her. Elizabeth tried to stop her, saying it was risky to act alone, but Catherine was set on doing what she thought was right, even if it put her own safety at risk. The last entry in Elizabeth's diary, written early in the morning of December 25th, was the most disturbing and revealing. She wrote about waking up in the middle of the night the previous day, and when Elizabeth looked for the hidden notebook, it had also disappeared. She left quietly and followed Catherine's footprints in the fresh snow that led to the mountains. The footprints were only hers, and there were no signs that she had been forced to leave. Elizabeth followed the footprints for about 2 kilometers until she lost them in a rocky area where the snow didn't stick. She stopped there, filled with an unimaginable fear. She wrote that she felt a scary presence there, like someone or something was watching her from behind the trees. She decided to go back to her mission and wait for dawn to come get help. But when the sheriff finally showed up days later, Elizabeth didn't say anything about following the footprints or Catherine's secret notebook. The diary ended with a mysterious sentence: "I know what happened to her, and carrying this knowledge is a burden that will accompany me until my last day. May God bless you." There were no more entries after that. The pages that came next had been torn out or burned, so it was impossible to tell. Margaret Sinclair was very upset when she found the diary. She made copies of it and took it to the local authorities, hoping that after all these years, someone would finally look into the case seriously. But the response was disappointing. A municipal historian looked at it and said that while it was interesting from a historical point of view, there was no more than that. There was nothing that could be done about the case because it happened more than 100 years ago, and there was no evidence of a crime. The teacher didn't give up easily. She wrote articles for local newspapers and did interviews with small radio stations to try to get people interested in the mystery. Some people were interested, but most saw it as folklore, an Appalachian urban legend with no basis in reality. Margaret found that bringing up the subject also attracted people who were interested in the mystery. She started getting anonymous phone calls at night, with no one answering, and letters with no return address telling her to stop getting involved in things that didn't concern her. Margaret was scared, but determined, so she made one last attempt. She went to the site of the old mission, which is now a commercial parking lot, and then to the area where the abandoned chapel had stood. There, where historical ruins once stood, she found only a modern road. There were no more physical signs of the past, no reminders that anything important had ever happened there. When Margaret Sinclair got home that day, she felt like she was fighting against unseen forces that wanted to keep the past hidden. She put copies of Sister Elizabeth's diary in a bank vault and decided to try a different approach. Instead of trying to get attention from the public, she started looking quietly for the children and grandchildren of the people involved, hoping that they would help her. After so many generations, someone would be willing to reveal long-kept secrets. Margaret spent months researching her family tree until she found an old woman named Dorothy Ashford. Dorothy was the great-granddaughter of one of the men whose names showed up in old case documents. Dorothy lived alone on a farm outside of Asheville, away from people and prying eyes. When Margaret first tried to contact Dorothy, she was politely turned down, but something about the professor's persistence must have won her over. Weeks later, Dorothy called the old woman to ask to meet up. The meeting took place on an autumn afternoon in 1968. Dorothy was 86 years old, but her mind was clear and her memory was sharp. She served tea in old porcelain cups and began to talk, but not before making Margaret promise that nothing she said would be published while she was still alive. The professor agreed, eager to finally hear the truth, even if it meant waiting years to share it. Dorothy told Margaret how her family had been hurt. There was a story that had been told for generations about Catherine Marlowe and the events of 1849. It was always told in secret, and people were warned not to talk about it with anyone outside the family. Catherine's great-grandfather, Henry Ashford, was a member of the secret society that met in the mountains. The family story said that the society wasn't bad or illegal, but rather a group of men who wanted to learn more about spirituality than what was offered by traditional religious institutions. Members were mostly Protestants and Catholics who felt stifled by their church's strict rules. They studied ancient texts, looked into alternative philosophies, and held ceremonies that mixed parts of different traditions. For them, it was a legitimate search for deeper spiritual truths. They kept it a secret because they thought society would not understand or accept their practices, and they were afraid of being persecuted for their religion. Catherine Marlowe found out about these groups. Catherine learned about the meetings through confessions and her own observations. At first, the group members tried to talk to her, explain their reasons, and persuade her that there was nothing wrong with what they were doing. But Catherine, who was devoted to the strict teachings of the Catholic Church, saw their actions as heresy and threatened to make sure they were all punished. On the night of December 23, 1849, Dorothy says Catherine died. Catherine went to the empty chapel where the group was meeting with a notebook full of names, dates, and detailed descriptions of the people she had seen. There was a heated argument, and the men tried to negotiate by saying they would end the meetings and begging Catherine not to hurt their reputations and families. But Catherine was firm in her morals and would not give in. Dorothy said quietly that what happened next was something her family had always deeply regretted. Some bad decisions were made because of the stress and despair. Catherine wasn't hurt physically. The old woman wanted to stress that, but she was taken against her will to a location even farther away in the mountains. The plan was to keep her there until they could convince her not to tell anyone about the group, or at least until they found a way to keep everyone safe. But the harsh winter made things more difficult. It started to snow heavily that night. As a result, trails were blocked and it was very dangerous to move. The group split up, promising to return as soon as conditions got better. When they did, days later, Catherine wasn't there. There were signs that she had tried to leave on her own, going in an unknown direction through the snowstorm. They looked for her, but the mountains had swallowed up any trace. Dorothy said that her great-grandfather felt guilty about what happened for the rest of his life. They thought Catherine had gotten lost in the snow and died from the cold somewhere in the harsh mountains. The group decided not to tell anyone what had happened, because that would mean admitting to the kidnapping and their other secret activities. Instead, they kept quiet and used their power to make sure the case wasn't fully investigated. Catherine's notebook of evidence also disappeared, and Dorothy thought that maybe the nun had hidden it somewhere during her time of hiding. Her family was always afraid that the notebook would be found one day and reveal secrets they wanted to keep hidden. Throughout the years, whenever someone started to look into the case too closely, powerful family members used their connections to stop or discourage the research. Margaret listened quietly as Dorothy talked. When Dorothy was done, the teacher asked about Catherine's erasure from the church records. The elder sighed and said that her family had been sad about it. People in the group had always thought that someone had ties to the Dacis. After the disappearance, this contact would have been used to get the church to help keep the incident quiet. After all, a scandal involving a nun and a secret society would hurt no one, not the church, not the families involved, and certainly not the nun. Dorothy ended her story with a sad thought. She said that her family had grown rich and powerful over the years, but there was always a shadow over them. That secret was passed down from generation to generation, and even though no one alive was directly responsible for what happened, everyone felt responsible to protect the memory of their ancestors. It was a cycle of silence that she hoped could finally end after she died. Margaret thanked her for her trust and kept her promise. She kept that conversation a secret for the next few years, visiting Dorothy every once in a while until the old woman died in 1972. Only then did the professor find out about it. When she tried to publish her detailed account, no one was interested because the case was too old, too controversial, and didn't have enough solid evidence that could be independently checked. The 1980s brought new technologies and ways to study history, but the mystery of Catherine Marlowe remained shrouded in layers of time and planned silence. Margaret Sinclair died in 1979 and left her papers to the Asheville Historical Library. For more than a decade, those papers were kept secret. The documents were kept in closed boxes and cataloged, but they weren't looked at very often. The missing nun's story seemed destined to become a forgotten footnote in Appalachian history. In 1994, a graduate student named Jennifer Hayes was writing her dissertation on the history of Catholic religious orders in the southern United States. While looking through archives donated by Margaret Sinclair, Jennifer found Sister Elizabeth's diary and the detailed notes her professor had made over the years. The researcher was immediately interested in the case because it had a historical mystery, questions of institutional power, and a deeply moving human story. Jennifer decided to use modern research methods to look into it. To start, she used digitized records that were becoming more accessible through efforts to preserve historical records. She searched genealogical databases, property records, court documents, and official correspondence. Gradually, she started to put together a more complete picture of, in 1849, and the people who lived there. One of Jennifer's most important discoveries came from immigration records. She found proof that some of the men in the secret society had come to the U.S. from Europe in the mid-1840s. Many of them were political or religious refugees running away from persecution in their home countries, which helped explain why they looked for other ways to express their spirituality away from the public eye. Jennifer also found that the Asheville area had an interesting history of hidden religious diversity. In the 1800s, the isolated Appalachian Mountains were home to communities of Quakeros, dissenting Methodists, spiritualists, and other groups that didn't fit into traditional denominations. In this setting, the existence of a secret society exploring alternative philosophies wasn't as strange as it seemed at first. Historical weather records showed that the winter of 1849-1850 was especially bad. Between December and February, the area was hit by intense snowstorms. Temperatures dropped to dangerous levels, and several people died from being out in the cold during that time. This supported the Ashford family's story that Catherine got lost in a storm, but the researcher was troubled by some inconsistencies. If Catherine had really died in the mountains because of the storm, it was cold, so why was her body never found? Sheriff Hicks had done a lot of searching, and even with the snow, it was thought that some trace would be found the following spring, when the thaw happened. Travelers who got lost in the mountains at that time were eventually found, and their bodies were identified by hunters or settlers. But there was no record of the discovery of human remains that could be linked to the missing nun. Jennifer was also interested in Catherine's complete erasure. Although the church wanted to avoid a scandal, systematically deleting all records about a nun was strange. It showed a level of planning and determination that went beyond just wanting to forget an embarrassing event. Someone in charge had decided that Catherine Marlowe needed to be erased from history. The researcher tried to get in touch with the Order of the Sisters of Mercy again, decades after Edmund Whitmore's attempts, this time using a different method. She had academic credentials and a more formal approach. She was only able to get limited access to some archives. What she found was telling because it wasn't there. detailed records of almost every nun who worked for the order in the 19th century. But Catherine Marlowe wasn't in them. There was no record of her entry, vows, appointments, or even a mention of her name. However, Jennifer made a crucial discovery. She found an 1848 document that listed nuns assigned to the case before she went missing. Sister C.M. was going to North Carolina, but there was only her initials next to her name. When Jennifer asked to see the documents related to this assignment, she was told that they had been lost during a reorganization of files. The coincidence was too strange to ignore. The student also looked into what happened to Sister Elizabeth, who wrote the diary. She found out that Elizabeth had been transferred to a remote convent by looking at the order's records. Elizabeth moved to Louisiana soon after the events in Asheville and lived there the rest of her life, dying in 1882. None of the letters Elizabeth wrote over the years, which were supposed to be kept safe according to the order's rules, had survived. It was as if someone had gone through the records and carefully removed anything that might have been related to the events of 1849. Jennifer included all of these findings in her thesis and dedicated an entire chapter to the Catherine Marlowe case. Her academic advisor told her to be careful. A professor told her that her conclusions should be based on facts and not just speculation for a thesis. The researcher agreed and kept her analysis within the rules of academia. But in her personal notes, she wrote that she was sure there was a long-running plot of silence. The thesis was approved in 1996 and put in the university's archives. Jennifer wrote some academic articles about certain parts of her research, but Catherine's case never got much attention. Most historians thought that without physical evidence or official records, it was impossible to come to a firm conclusion about what had really happened. The mystery remained a mystery with no clear solution. But Jennifer didn't give up. She kept in touch with local historians in Asheville and kept gathering information over the years. In 2003, she learned something that sparked her interest again. During an excavation for the building of a new residential complex in the mountains near Asheville, workers found what looked like the entrance to a man-made cave or tunnel hidden beneath layers of dirt and plants. Local authorities looked into it for a short time, but decided it was just an old, abandoned mine from the 19th century that was common in the area. Jennifer Hayes went to Asheville as soon as she heard about the find and was determined to personally investigate the ancient underground structure. The coordinates of the construction were in an area that. It turned out that the calculations based on historical maps were pretty close to where the old, abandoned chapel stood. The coincidence was too big to ignore. At first, the people in charge of the project wouldn't let Jennifer see the structure because they were worried about safety and had a tight construction schedule. But Jennifer didn't give up. She called the county's Historic Preservation Department and said that any old building should be properly documented before it was torn down or sealed off. After a few weeks of bureaucratic red tape, she finally got access. The site was okay for a supervised visit. The building's entrance was small and partially collapsed, leading to a narrow tunnel carved into rock and earth. Jennifer carefully descended the uneven steps, accompanied by an expert in historical structures and a representative from the construction company. The air was thick and humid, smelling like old earth and dying plants. The walls showed clear signs of manual work, with tool marks from before modern times. The tunnel went down about 15 meters and opened up into a bigger room. When people went inside, they were surprised to see that the room wasn't just a mine, but seemed to have been built for a specific reason. The walls had niches carved into them at regular intervals, and the ceiling was held up by ancient wooden beams that miraculously still had their shape, even though they were badly damaged. What was even more amazing was what was left on the floor of the room. Some broken pieces of candles, rusty metal that could have been candlesticks or other ritual items, and carvings on the walls that looked a lot like those found in the old chapel that was torn down decades before. Jennifer carefully photographed everything, her heart racing with excitement that she might have found the secret place where the occult society actually met. While looking at the niches in the walls, she found something that made her cold. There was an object wrapped in rotting fabric. Jennifer carefully removed the object while shaking and wearing the right gloves. It was a small book with a leather cover that had hardened over time but was surprisingly still in good shape, considering how long it had been there. The pages were stained and fragile but readable, and on the first page was the name Catherine Marlowe, written in careful, delicate handwriting. It was the lost notebook, the record of the shadows, that Sister Elizabeth had written about in her diary. Finally, after more than 150 years, the evidence that Catherine had gathered was being shown. Jennifer didn't open the notebook right away because she knew that the document needed to be handled by professionals in a controlled setting. Instead, she took a picture of it at the spot where it was found, carefully writing down its location and context, and then took it with her with permission from the authorities who were there. She started the careful process of digitizing and transcribing the notebook's contents. What was written there supported many of Jennifer's ideas. Catherine had written down names, dates of meetings, and descriptions of ceremonies and practices that mixed elements of different spiritual traditions. There were references to Gnostic texts, Hermetic philosophies, and rituals that mixed Christian and pagan symbols. By the religious standards of 1849, this would have been considered heresy, but the notebook had more than that. In the last few pages, which looked like they were written quickly, Catherine wrote about her decision to confront the group and her determination to expose what she saw as a serious spiritual corruption. She wrote about getting veiled threats, feeling like she was being followed, and being afraid that something bad might happen to her. The last entry was dated December 23, 1849, and was written hours before she disappeared. In it, Catherine explained what she thought was going on. She knew she was putting the notebook somewhere safe in case something happened to her. If it disappeared, she hoped that someone would find her notes and the truth would come out. It was a message from the Pasta nun sending her testimony through time in the hopes that justice would be done, even if it took a while. Jennifer was moved as she read those words. Catherine knew she was in danger, but she stuck to her morals. The researcher spent weeks looking through the notebook, comparing the information in the notebook to other historical records. Everything fit together. The names listed matched well-known people in Asheville at the time, and the dates of the meetings matched times when these men would have been in the area. The discovery got some academic attention. Jennifer wrote articles about it, and after being fully digitized, the notebook was given to the Asheville Historical Society. Some descendants of the families whose names were in the document spoke out. Some defended their ancestors as misunderstood men who were only looking for religious freedom, while others were embarrassed that their ancestors had been involved in Catherine's disappearance. But even though the notebook was found, it didn't answer the main question: what happened to Catherine Marlowe that night? The notebook was hidden in the underground chamber, which suggests she had been there at some point. But how had she gotten out? Where had she gone? Jennifer came up with a theory based on all the evidence she had seen. She thought that Catherine had hidden the notebook in the underground chamber before going to the abandoned chapel for the final confrontation. This was done as a safety measure to make sure that her work wouldn't be lost if something happened to her. When she was taken against her will after the confrontation, she would have tried to escape in the snowstorm, but the harsh conditions would have made it impossible. According to this theory, Catherine's body was probably still in the mountains, maybe in a deep ravine or natural cave where it would never be found. The Appalachians are full of secrets, and unsolved disappearances were common at the time. The wilderness had claimed the nun, and time had erased her physical presence from the world. Jennifer thought that the church had been told about the systematic erasure of church records. Someone with connections probably a powerful member of the secret society, opened the case. The institution chose to be completely secret because it didn't want to deal with the complicated effects of Catherine's moral crusade. Over the next few years, the Catherine Marlowe case was slowly looked at again. Jennifer Hayes's work had finally been recognized. In the 19th century, historians started to look again at the role of women's religious orders, especially in frontier areas where these women often faced dangers and problems that traditional historical narratives tended to downplay or ignore completely. In 2008, the Asheville Historical Society put together an exhibition about forgotten figures in local history. Catherine Marlowe's digitized diary and photos of There was a detailed timeline of what happened in 1849 and an underground chamber where the notebook was found. The exhibition got a lot of attention from both academics and locals interested in this dark part of their city's history that many had never heard of. The gallery walls showed enlarged pages from Catherine's notebook. Her carefully written words were now bigger so that visitors could read her private thoughts and growing worries. There were maps showing where the old mission, the abandoned chapel, and the underground chamber found in 2003 were located. Archival photos showed what Asheville looked like in the 1800s, when it was a small town surrounded by mountains that kept its residents safe and isolated. The exhibition also caused a lot of controversy. Some descendants of the families involved spoke out strongly against it, saying that it made their ancestors look like bad guys when in reality they were just men looking for work. They remembered that many of those men had left persecution in Europe and come to the mountains of North Carolina to get away from strict religious beliefs. Other descendants, on the other hand, praised the initiative, seeing it as a chance to finally face uncomfortable truths that had been brushed under the rug for too long. Some families admitted that stories about strange events in 1849 had been passed down through the generations, always in a mild way, accompanied by warnings not to talk about the case in public. During the exhibition, something completely unexpected happened that would change the way people understood the case again. In the third week of the exhibition, an old man named Marcus Hrix went to see it and surprised the organizers by telling them that he was the great-great-grandson of Sheriff Thomas Hrix, the original investigator of Catherine's disappearance. He brought with him an old wooden box with family records that had never been seen before. Marcus told them that his great-great-grandfather had left clear instructions in his will. The papers in the box were not to be destroyed, but they also weren't to be shared until other ways of finding out the truth about Catherine Marlowe started to appear. Thomas Hrix had predicted that one day, after enough time had passed and the people involved were long dead, someone would start to. If you asked the right questions, the documents would only be useful without putting living people in danger. One of the documents was a letter that Thomas Hendricks wrote to his older brother in 1851, 2 years after the disappearance. In the letter, the former sheriff talked about something he had found just before leaving Buncombe County. A willing informant who had been a part of the secret society meetings but felt very guilty about what they had done. According to this informant, whose story is told in detail in Hendrick's letter, Catherine did not get lost in the storm by accident. She was taken to the underground chamber, the same one that was found decades later during construction and kept there while the group heavily discussed what to do. The informant stressed over and over that the goal was never to hurt her physically, but to persuade her through logical arguments, to throw away her notes and promise not to talk about what she had found. The chamber was filled with heated arguments for several hours that cold December night. Some people tried to be sympathetic by saying that their families would be destroyed if they were found out. Others used religious arguments to defend their actions, saying that they were not anti-Christian, but rather a search for deeper spiritual truths that established religious institutions had hidden for too long. Many men knelt in front of her and begged her to think about the mercy that her faith taught. They offered her money and said that the group would never meet again if she wouldn't reveal their names. One of the wealthier members offered to give a lot of money to the mission, which would have let Catherine do more good deeds in the area. All she had to do was forget what she had seen, but Catherine wouldn't budge. For her, there was no way to compromise with what she saw as dangerous deviations from spiritual truth. She answered every argument with unwavering conviction, citing scripture and the church's authority and insisting that practices that mixed sacred teachings with pagan philosophies were gateways to demonic influences. For her, there was no middle ground between light and darkness. She told the men that they could lock her up, but that eventually the other nuns would find her and rescue her. Sheriff, and then by higher church officials. Everything would come to light anyway, she said, and keeping a nun against her will would only make her crimes look even worse in the eyes of the law and the church. Things reached a dangerous stalemate. The informant told Hicks that the hours were going by slowly, and some people in the group were thinking about more extreme options. There were rumors that Catherine should be locked up forever, maybe in secret. Transferring her to a different state, or even paying the authorities to say she left the area on her own. The emotional temperature in the underground chamber was rising dangerously, while the temperature outside was dropping dramatically. At that moment, the storm outside got much worse. The wind started howling through the trees with such force that it made the ground shake, and it snowed so hard that it was impossible to see more than a few steps ahead. The storm seemed to be a physical representation of the tension inside that chamber. Some of the men there, even though they were philosophical, started to believe that the storm was a sign that they had gone too far. One of the youngest men in the group, who the informant did not name but said was under 30, became more and more angry. He was scared that the situation would get worse and worse until it could no longer be fixed. Despite the objections of the older men, he got up, walked to the doorway of the chamber and opened it. He then turned to Catherine and told her she could leave. He hoped that this would make him feel better about his actions, and that the bad weather would keep her from trying to go too far into the cold and darkness. Maybe she would change her mind when she saw how dangerous things were, or maybe she would just wait nearby until the storm was over and more reasonable talks could start again in the morning. Catherine didn't do either. She didn't think about it for a second. According to the witness, she grabbed her rosary, changed her habit as best she could, and ran into the blizzard without looking back. She didn't have a proper cloak to protect her from the extreme cold, any food or water, or a lantern to light her way through the darkness. She was only driven by her unwavering determination to get to safety and report what had happened, trusting that her faith would protect her where material resources were lacking. The men there were shocked by her choice. After a moment of stunned silence as they thought about what had happened, they quickly started arguing about how to go after her right away. But some were paralyzed by fear of being seen, and others were able to use the real severity of the storm as an excuse to stay put. They reasoned that she would soon realize her mistake and turn around, or that she would find shelter in a nearby cabin, or that her miraculous faith would lead her to safety. But Catherine never came back. When the storm finally passed, when they finally got the courage to look for her 2 days later, there was no sign of her. The snow had covered everything during those 2 days, turning the whole landscape into a white void that erased any sign of her path. The informant told Hicks that this decision would haunt all of the men present for the rest of their lives, visiting them in nightmares and times of guilty conscience. Hendrick's letter ended with a deeply somber reflection that showed how heavy this decision was. He wrote to his brother that he had confirmed large parts of the story through other separate sources over months of careful investigation and was completely sure that it was true. Every detail he could check fit perfectly with the informant's story, creating a disturbing mosaic of human choices that led to an avoidable tragedy. The sheriff had tried to officially reopen the investigation with this new information, writing detailed reports, and he asked for more resources to search the mountains again as soon as the snow melted in the spring. But his superiors quickly told him that the case was officially closed and that bringing it up again would not help anyone. They used polite language, but the message was clear. Let the dead rest in peace, and do not disturb still waters. Rix knew at that moment that forces outside of his control had decided that the truth would stay buried with Catherine in the icy ground. Not only did powerful families in the area want to keep their secrets, but so did people in the state capital, and maybe even further. Telling the truth was seen as too political and socially costly, especially since the victim was a nun and didn't have a family that could demand justice. The sheriff wrote to his brother that he could no longer work in a place where justice could be so easily stifled for convenience, and he left Buncombe County a few months later. After that letter, he moved to a remote part of Kentucky to get away from the things that were bothering him. But he kept all the case documents and carefully guarded them with instructions so that the truth could come out when the time was right. The 2008 exhibition of Hendrick's documents added an even deeper and more tragic dimension to the case. Catherine had literally chosen to face a deadly storm rather than compromise her religious beliefs. What she did that night showed how brave she was and how impossible it is for people with such different worldviews to talk to each other because they have nothing in common. The men she met that night were not scary monsters. They were just regular people who made bad decisions under a lot of stress. Decisions that would haunt them like ghosts for the rest of their lives. It was a tragedy in the classic sense, where good intentions and human failings led to terrible results. The Asheville Historical Society immediately updated its exhibit with the new information that Marcus Hendris brought to light. The sheriff's letters were digitized and added to the collection, and panels were made to explain what the new information meant. Jennifer Hayes, who is now a respected history professor at a university in North Carolina, was invited to give a lecture on the case. She shared her decades of research with an ever-growing audience. Jennifer decided it was time to write the definitive book about Catherine Marlowe. It took her 2 years of work, but the book came out in 2010 and was called Voices in the Mountains, The Lost Story of Catherine Marlowe and the Secrets of the Appalachians. It wasn't sensationalist or overly dramatic. Instead, it was a careful and deeply sympathetic look at how personal beliefs, institutional power, and tragic circumstances came together to create a historical injustice that still affects people today, over many generations. The book got great reviews from historians and academics, who praised its thorough research and refusal to oversimplify the moral complexities of the case. Jennifer didn't make Catherine or the members of the secret society into one-dimensional bad guys. Instead, she showed them as flawed people who were trying to figure out impossible problems in a time and place where social structures were very different from those today. The Catherine Marlowe mystery became popular beyond academic circles. Reading groups talked about the books, history podcasts had episodes dedicated to the story, and tourists started coming to Asheville just to see places connected to the case. The city, which has always been proud of its rich history, slowly started to accept this dark story as part of its heritage. In 2012, the Catholic Diocese of North Carolina made an official statement about the case that surprised many people. The institution admitted that serious mistakes had been made in the past, and said it was very sorry that Catherine's name had been removed from church records and that her disappearance had not been properly investigated at the time. The statement said that the desire to avoid scandal had been stronger than the pursuit of justice and truth. The diocese announced that Catherine Marlowe's name would be officially added back to the records of the Sisters of Mercy, recognizing her service and sacrifice from the past. While the statement didn't give definitive answers about what happened that December night, it did acknowledge that institutional silence had played a big role in keeping an injustice going. It was a small but very important step toward historical truth and moral reparation. Local activists and members of Asheville's historic community started a strong campaign to build a permanent memorial to Catherine Marlowe. The initial proposal faced a lot of opposition from some. There were still families who didn't like how much attention was being paid to the case, but they slowly won over a lot of people. The winning argument was that honoring Catherine didn't mean forever condemning those involved in her disappearance, but rather recognizing that stories that have been silenced deserve to be told. The memorial would be purposely simple. A simple bronze plaque would be put in a park near the site of the old mission to honor not only Catherine, but all women whose stories have been silenced. Catherine's name was carefully carved into the memorial after months of debate. It recognized her as a woman of unwavering faith who paid the ultimate price for her beliefs. The ceremony to open the memorial happened in December 2013, exactly 164 years after she disappeared. It was a cold but clear day, and the Appalachian Mountains rose in the background. There were descendants of several families involved in the case there, some from far away. Representatives of the Catholic diocese led a short religious ceremony to bless the memorial and pray for Catherine's soul. Jennifer Hayes was asked to speak at the ceremony, and she did so with tears in her eyes. She talked about how the case showed how people had been holding pieces of the truth for decades, waiting for the right time to share them. But the most moving part of the ceremony might have been when an older Sisters of Mercy nun, who had come all the way from Baltimore, laid a wreath at the base of the memorial. She then read out loud Catherine's last diary entry, which was written hours before her death. Catherine's voice echoed through the quiet park, as if she were finally speaking. Over time, her message was finally heard by people who were ready to listen. In the years that followed, the memorial became an unexpected pilgrimage site. People came not only for historical reasons, but also to be inspired by the story of a woman who stayed true to herself until the end. Ethics students came to think about moral problems. Religious people of all faiths came to pray, and historians kept researching, always hoping to find that last piece of evidence that would finally solve everything. Even though a lot has been found, there are still some big questions that haven't been answered. For example, where did Catherine die in that storm? Is her body still somewhere in the mountains, maybe in a deep ravine or hidden cave, waiting to be found by a future hiker? Or has nature already taken her body back to the earth in a way that will never allow identification? There were other questions that could never be fully answered. What did Catherine feel as she walked alone through that deadly storm? Was she scared, or did her faith keep her going to the end? Did she feel bad about not negotiating, or did she die at peace knowing she had stuck to her beliefs? These were questions that only Catherine could answer, and she carried those answers with her wherever she went. The Appalachians hold many secrets in their deep valleys and old forests. They have seen many human dramas over the centuries. You can find thousands of stories like Catherine Marlowe's about bravery and cowardice, faith and betrayal, love and loss. Each story reminds us that every life is important, every voice should be heard, and the truth will always come out. Today, when people walk through the streets of Asheville or hike in the nearby mountains, few realize they are walking on ground that holds such deep mysteries. That place has changed, grown, and is now a popular tourist spot known for its craft beers and lively art scene. But if you listen, you can still hear echoes of the past. The Appalachian Nun, who was erased from history, has finally been added again, not as a forgotten footnote, but as a powerful reminder that truth matters, that justice is worth waiting for, and that voices that are silenced will eventually be heard through time. Catherine Marlowe waited. It took her more than 150 years to finally tell her story, and we listened. If you made it this far on this trip through the shadows of the past, I hope you found something that makes you think about how complicated people are and how time can hide secrets. This channel exists to bring up disturbing stories like this one, mysteries that make us question what we thought we knew. Leave a like so that more people can find these interesting stories. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next cases we'll be looking into together. And in the comments, let us know what you thought of this story. Did you think Catherine made the right choice by not negotiating, or was there another way to go? Your opinion matters, and I love reading all of your comments. Until the next time, kept for.